Hello everyone, today we are going to do array2 pre-for. So given a non-empty array of integers, we want to return a new array containing the elements from the original array that come before the first four in the original array. So the original array will contain at least one four. So essentially here, when we have, we have an array and we sense that the first four moving from left to right is of course sensed, and then we want all the elements which come before the first four. Similarly, in this array here, we sense a 4 at the end of the array, the very end of the array, and we want all the elements that come before that as well. And here, maybe you'd think that we would want all the elements that come before the last 4, but of course the caveat in this particular case is that we want all the elements that come before the first 4, and of course the first 4 is the second 4, not in fact the third. So I'm going to open up, let's see here. So I want to actually, I want to take this over to IntelliJ, and I'm going to have this here. So I want to take this over to IntelliJ because I think it leaves us with more clear of a place to work with. So we are going to have a public static void main and string args. That is, of course, our main method signature. And just for the purpose of this particular video here, I can't run it against test cases until I actually have an array. So I just copied this array from of course, CodingBat. And what we'll do here is we'll say, okay, well, the first thing is I want to be able to iterate through the array, nums.length, I++. And over here, I can say, well, if nums of I is equal to 4, that is, of course, to say if any given element referenced by any given index at any given time is equal to 4, then we want to go ahead and do something, right? And so the idea here, and if I could just probably open this up in Paint, is, let's see, so let me go ahead and share this Paint screen here. So the idea here is to recognize that usually we would have, let's say, 1, 2, and 3 boxes, right? And each of these boxes, of course, I mean, they have indexes, and of course these are essentially the indexes. The numbers below are essentially the indexes. And if, of course, we sense a 4, then we want all the elements that essentially come before the 4. That is, of course, these elements. So let's go ahead and iterate through the array one by one, incrementing the index by 1 each and every time we do that. And as we look at the elements, if at all we sense a 4, let's go ahead and flag the index where we sensed that 4. And where we caught that 4, well, that would be a marker, right? And the marker is, okay, we don't want anything after it. Suppose this array, suppose this array was, in fact, it had more elements here. What if it had 5? And suppose to say that we had, let's say, a 5 in here, or let's say a 6. Well, actually a better example would be to say, what if we had 6 here, and then of course a 4 here. So the idea here is that we only want the elements which come before the first 4, and of course the first 4 in this case is this one, not this one. So we do need a flag, and the flag would essentially be, okay, where did we sense the first 4? And then we can work from there. And so essentially, after we sense the first 4, we want to essentially use the keyword break. And what that is going to do is it's going to keep iterating, and then as soon as we sense the first 4, it's going to break out. Otherwise, it's going to sense the second 4, because we know that that arrays usually iterate for I is less than nums.length time, which is of course the entire array. It looks at all the elements. So as soon as it catches that 4, we are going to break out of the array, and we're going to set a flag, so that, and that flag will essentially tell us where that index was. And so doing that, let's see. So we're now here back in the code, and we say, okay, if we're iterating through, as I said before, and if nums of I is equal to 4, then we're going to essentially, well, we're going to break. We're going to break out of the array. And now we are in this domain here, everything after the for loop. Now, the theory here is to understand, the theory here is to understand that what we want to do in this case is, if of course we sense a 4, right? Oops, okay. So if of course we sense a 4, then we want the elements which come before. And so in essence, this entire thing is the nums array. And we want to create, essentially, we want to create a new array, right? And that new array, we're going to call it, actually, we're going to call it new array. We're going to be very specific in this case. And I mean, so that new array is essentially going to, well, if you think about it, how many elements is the new array going to have? Let me solidify the example here. These are our elements, these are our indexes. So we want everything that comes after the 4 or before the 4. In other words, we only want these many elements. So in other words, we only want 2 elements in our new array, right? Because that's actually how many elements are before the first 4. And so we only want, so the length of the array should be 2. But of course, if we had, let's say, let's say this inside here was not in fact a 4. Let's suppose it was, let's say, another 8. And oops, let's probably use the same color to be consistent. Let's suppose it was another 8. And here we had 4. Well, this would of course bring our total index count to 3. And we would now not want just the first 2, but we would want this as well, because we want all the elements which come before the first 4. What would our length be? So we know that we have an array, but we have to declare the length to populate it, right? Eventually, we want to populate it with, all 3 of these elements. But the goal here is to really understand that we have to first populate the array in order to actually, well, we have to declare the length of the array in order to actually populate it. So do we have an objective way to judge what the length of the array will be? Well, I argue yes. I argue yes because the length of the array, although is 4, you'll notice that the number of elements that we would want to have will always be the index that we were on when we sensed the 4. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is, if we were iterating through, we're iterating through, we're iterating through, we're iterating through, and as soon as we sense the first 4, you'll notice that the index that we're on is 3. And you'll also notice that the number of elements that we want in our array is in fact 3. Hence, the length of the array that we would want in the case of this particular array would be 3, right? And similarly, if suppose we had more elements, suppose we had 5. Suppose we had 5 elements. And of course, suppose that the array actually did not have a 4 at this place. Instead, it had a 7, and we had a 4 here. Okay. In fact, you could go as far as to say, let's make the example a little more complicated. Let's just say that we had, let's say that we had 5, right? 5 here. We want all the elements which come before the first 4. Now, of course, if we do want that, then not only do we want those elements, but we want this one as well. What would the length of the array be now? It's not 3. That remains to be seen. What is the length of the array now? Well, you'll notice that the total number of indexes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so you notice that the total number of indexes is now 5. But you'll notice that the index that we're on when we sense the 4 is essentially the amount of elements that we want to, the length that we want to have, because there are 4 elements. So in other words, in order to summarize, when we sense or when we catch a 4, the length of the array, which is the number of elements we want to have, is the quantity of the index the index which is responsible for referencing the 4 that we first sensed, or that we first caught. Okay, so it would make sense to have a flag, and that flag will essentially tell us which index we're at, and that would be the length of our array. Let's go ahead and do this. So if, of course, we do sense a 4, we are going to have a flag. That flag will be called index. And the index will be 0. Or actually, the index will be I, whichever index we sensed that particular element on, we will make our flag, which is, of course, index. So as we're iterating through, we sense a 4. And if we do sense a 4, then we mark where that 4 was sensed. And then we break out of the for loop so it doesn't go on sensing more. We already have everything we need. So after we're out of the for loop, we can make another for loop to actually populate the array. That is, to populate the new array. Now, new array doesn't yet exist, but we know that that we only want to iterate for new array.length. And new array.length will essentially be equal to the index that was sensed. Now, we actually have to create new array equals, we actually have to create new array, right? It doesn't particularly exist yet. New array equals new int, right? And here we'll have the index, just because we know that wherever we sensed this 4, which was index, will essentially be the quantity of the elements that we want to have. And at this point, we can very safely say that the length of the array will be the index that we were on when we sensed the 4. And we will iterate for new array.length because we only want, why are we iterating for new array.length? Because new array.length will essentially just be 4. In this case, it would just be 4, or however many elements that came before the first 4 in the array. And so it makes sense to only have those many elements in the array. And of course, if we want those many elements, we have to have a length of that quantity. And what we're going to do now is we're going to say, okay, new array, that is, of course, the first element, or rather, we're going to have I so that I increments each time and gives us a new index, which actually allows us to populate a new element, while, of course, we populate only I is less than new array.length times. So new array of I will equal nums of I, right? And let's see here. Is this a good idea? Well, let's see. Let's go ahead and print out the contents of new array. You'll see that we got essentially the numbers that came before the first 4. If we extend on this and actually change the position of the 4, we should be able to 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1. Suppose we had a 4 here. What would it give us? 1, 2, 3, 1. Let's take our code and try to work with CodingBat. We have to return new array. And when we do, we're golden. Let's go look at some more solutions. You can see that this person had a very simplistic solution, it seems. Definitely not as long as what we had. Seems like he has int I is equal to 0. So while nums of I does not equal to 4, keep incrementing I by 1, and keep updating the length of the array. Interesting. And of course, for int I is equal to 0, j must be less than I, j plus plus. It's an interesting solution. Here it seems like they did something very similar to us, except without using. They've used a nested for loop instead of actually using a 2 separate for loops.